All right, welcome everyone. It's about 1 o'clock here, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining today. The Oregon Department of Forestry is going to provide an update on the Western Oregon State Forest Management Plan and the Habitat Conservation Plan. So really appreciate everyone joining. Many faces that we've seen before and a lot of new faces as well. I'm Sylvia Chiborowski with Currents and West, and I'll just be helping to facilitate today's meeting. And we have a full suite of Oregon Department of Forestry presenters on deck, and they'll be introducing themselves as they join to make their presentations. But I'll just do a little bit of intro and agenda review, and then we can just dive right in. So if we go to the next slide. Just a couple of reminders for remote participation. I think we've all been in Zoom world for a really long time, so we're all experts, but just reminders to keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. And if you're joined by phone only, just go ahead and press *6 to stay on mute. We're going to have several options today to have Q&A and hear your input. So if you have any questions or comments, just use the raise your hand button to get into the queue, and we'll show you how to do that on the next slide. We encourage you to use your video. Feel free to stay off video during presentations and such, but if you're asking questions and everything, it's always nice to have the face-to-face interaction. And just a reminder to also say your name and affiliation before you speak. If you have any issues with kind of technology or troubleshooting today, just use the chat feature for troubleshooting. You can chat the host, and best to chat Ellen Palmquist or Angela Hesenius, who can help with that. And throughout today, we're going to have opportunities for you to ask your questions. But if you have any written questions or anything longer that you want to provide to the Oregon Department of Forestry, you can email that to Tim Hoffman. And that email address is up on the screen, and we'll also put that in the chat in just a moment. So let's go to the next slide. So just reminders of the Zoom features, mute buttons on the left side here. In the middle is a participant list, and that's where you can go to see who's in the meeting, and also to find your own participant name and change it if you'd like. We'd love to know your first, last name, and affiliation if you have one. And then there's also a chat menu under the More button where you can get to a chat box for any troubleshooting or any issues, or to see the various links that we're going to be putting in the meeting throughout the day today. All right, next slide. Okay, so it's just some discussion guidelines. As we go through today, we have an agenda with topics that are building on each other. So we hope that you can honor the agenda, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So kind of holding your questions until those times. We'd also ask for a balance of speaking time. So if you're asking a lot of questions and there isn't an opportunity for others, maybe just step back a little bit. And if you have questions, please bring them up. Don't be shy, so that everyone has an opportunity to ask what they would like to ask today. We hope they're asking questions to really understand and to get clarification and to listen, and that we're respecting each other's points of views, values, and interests. We know there are a lot of different interests in the room today. And we also hope that you will focus your comments on the topics at hand. We know that the Oregon Department of Forestry is involved in multiple planning efforts, and today we're really focused on the State Forest Management Plan and the Western Oregon Habitat Conservation Plan. So trying to focus your questions and comments on those pieces. Next slide. Okay, so our agenda for today. So after I stop speaking here, we're going to hand it over to Mike Wilson to provide just a little bit of a welcome to the group. And we're going to focus today on an update on the Forest Management Plan and on its components. So the last time we came to the public in a meeting format like this was back in December of 2021. So today really stepping back and reminding you an overview of what the Forest Management Plan is and going into some of its key components. And then we'll also have today to go over, we'll have time today to go over the Western Oregon Habitat Conservation Plan and the NEPA process. So that the HCP is currently in the National Environmental Policy Act process, so giving you an update on where we are there. And then we'll end with summary and next steps. And that agenda should take us through about 3 o'clock. And we've got an optional hour at the end of the meeting here for additional question and discussion time if needed. So we'll use that if people have questions, and if not, then we'll end early sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock. Next slide. All right, so at this point, I will hand it over to Mike Wilson for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Michael Wilson, the State Forest Division Chief, and I really want to thank everybody here for joining us today to discuss our forest management planning process. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that ODF acknowledges that the tribes are the original stewards of the lands that we currently manage, and we do seek to honor tribal ties to these lands by integrating their interests and perspectives in our planning and implementation processes at every level. We have made significant progress in tribal engagement over the past year, and we really look forward to continuing that work and developing meaningful and lasting relationships with the tribes. Today, the primary focus of our discussion is going to be on certain components of the forest management plan, specifically the management approach for the forest management plan, the guidelines for implementation, including asset management, implementation guidelines themselves, and adaptive management. And we will also provide a brief update on the forest resources goals and strategies, an update on that work that's being done there. Our staff and consultants have been working very hard over the last year to develop an FMP that provides a full range of social, economic, and environmental benefits to the people of Oregon. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this great body of work. So Sylvia, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. All right, let's go to the next slide. And I just want to provide some information on our project leaders before we dive into the next topic. So for the Habitat Conservation Plan, if you have any questions after today's meeting, feel free to get in touch with Cindy Kolomachuk, the project manager for that. And then for the Forest Management Plan, get in touch with Jen McAdoo, and she is a new project manager for that effort. So that information's up on the screen, and we'll also put it in the chat. And so in a minute, I'm going to hand it over to Ron Zilli to provide an overview of the Forest Management Plan. And as Ron and others go through the slides here, we'd love it if you could kind of hold your questions till the end of the slides. You know, if you have any questions, jot them down so that we can get through the material, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ron.
Thank you, Sylvia, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ron Zilli, and I serve as the Deputy Division Chief for State Forests. You know, as Mike also said, thank you for your interest in state forests, and appreciate you being here today. In this presentation, we're going to give you a brief overview of the Western Oregon State Forest Management Plan. For anybody might be new, we'll go over some sort of fundamental context, and then we'll give you an update on the work we've been doing the past year and what we've got planned for the year to come. Change the slide, please. One more. All right. So back in October of 2020, the Board of Forestry gave direction to State Forest Division to continue the development of a forest management plan and implementation plans for about 640,000 acres of Oregon Department of Forestry managed lands west of the Cascades. And this, area of the planning area coincides with the area covered under our Habitat Conservation Plan. So they are companion to some extent, or parallel planning processes that we have going on. The mission of the Western State Oregon Forest Management Plan and Implementation Plan is to establish a policy framework, and if approved, would be the overarching documents for how we would implement and derive greatest permanent value on these Western Oregon state forests. It would also replace the current Northwest Oregon Forest Management Plan and Southwest Forest Management Plan and related implementation plans. The management context for the development of the forest management plans is contained in Oregon Revised Statute, the Greatest Permanent Value Administrative Rule, and our State Forest Planning Rule. Next, I'm going to walk through the policy and planning framework and discuss the relationship of the forest management plan with other plans, policies, and performance measures. So if you go to the next slide. So this is a busy slide. Hopefully it being in Zoom format, you can all see it on your screens. Okay, but what I'm gonna, walk through here, at the top of this graphic, we have policy level pieces that are under the purview of the Board of Forestry, and those consist of the Forest Management Plan and the Board of Forestry performance measures. So the Forest Management Plan that we're talking about today, it's a strategic long-range plan adopted by the Board of Forestry as administrative rule, and the Forest Management Plan contains guiding principles, the management approach, goals and strategies, and guidelines for asset management, implementation, and adaptive management, which we will discuss in more detail later in this presentation. To the right of that box in yellow is performance measures. And the Board of Forestry uses performance measures to track how the Forest Management Plan is providing greatest permanent value to Oregonians. This document proposes a set of performance measures for social, economic, and environmental goals intended to be adopted with the Forest Management Plan, and that's still a work in progress that we'll talk more about as we go through the presentation today. Tearing down from that, we have supporting plans and plans that feed into lower level operational plans. So to the far left, we have the Habitat Conservation Plan. This is intended to serve as a holistic, proactive landscape approach to achieving economic, environmental, and social benefits while protecting federally listed threatened and endangered species. Moving a little bit closer to the center, dropping down just a little bit, we have Forest Land Management Classification System. This system classifies all land within the planning area and describes the appropriate range of management activities for these areas. Shifting to the box just right of center and a little bit up in blue, there is policy standards, which cover a range of administrative and operational activities to guide and direct our work. On the far right is the Adaptive Management Plan. The Adaptive Management Plan provides a framework for implementing plans in a scientifically based, systematically structured approach that tests and monitors assumptions and predictions in the management plan and uses the resulting information to improve the plan or management practices used to implement them. And then lastly, in the center here, we've got three backbone elements of our implementation, which are implementation plans, operational plans, and then the funding level necessary to support all of this work. And I'm going to go into just a little bit more detail on the next slide with those. So why don't you go ahead and shift slides. So, again, just sort of summarizing how they tear down. We talked about the Forest Management Plan, that overall higher level goals and strategies piece, how the Habitat Conservation Plan fits in, providing the majority of the conservation strategies, and then that tiered down into implementation plans. So these are sub-geographic plans with mid-level objectives and goals, typically 10 years in time frame. The implementation plans are approved by our state forester, prepared by staff, and approved by our state forester. And then those are further put into operational implementation at the administrative district level through operations plans, which include the very specific and spatially detailed project level locations, goals, et cetera, that we're going to do each fiscal year or a couple fiscal years in operations. And those plans are approved by district foresters. Next slide, please. So here's a timeline of where we are in the overall process. This process, as I mentioned, when I started, began prior even to 2020, but in 2020, the board had directed us to continue, developing, this plan. In the spring of 2021, we had our first meeting, open to the public. And then also in 2021, we shared the guiding principles and draft goals. Then back in March of 2022, we shared our draft strategies. And then over the past year, we've been doing a lot of work on the management approach chapter, completing and revising the remaining chapters. And, for information purposes, prior to this meeting, we also shared the management approach and guidelines chapter. So there's been quite a while before there'd been anything out, and that's what we had been working on primarily during that time was the management approach chapter, guidelines chapter, and continuing to refine goals and strategies. So that brings us up to, where we are here in the summer. In the winter of 2023. And what we're working towards is our September Board of Forestry meeting, where we're striving to have a completed draft forest management plan for the board to review in September of 2023 that will be accompanied by draft performance measures as well. We'll then take feedback from the board, and if there's any adjustments that need to be made, we'll be working to make those by the end of calendar year 2023 and taking a completed completed forest management plan to the board for a decision to move into rulemaking in January of 2024. And then anticipating roughly a 6-month timeframe for rulemaking, we would expect to have the rule approved in the summer, roughly July of 2024. So that's where we're at with the timeline for the project. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Just to cover, some of the highlights of engagement we've had during the forest management development process to date. There's been engagement with the tribal coordination. There were 6 work group meetings held between August of 2021 and April of 2022, and we have ongoing engagement with the tribes. There have been a series of forest management plan meetings open to the public. We've had thus far 4 meetings with roughly 50 to 70 attendees per meeting between May and December of 2021. We had joint stakeholder meetings, 3 separate meetings with 20 to 40 attendees between August and December of 2021. We've taken feedback on the strategies from the public. We had over 3,000 survey comments and 318 emails to help inform refinements to the strategies. We've been working with the Board of Forestry throughout this process. They've adopted the guiding principles for the forest management plan already, which is annotated on here. And then we've been sharing with them the draft management approach and goals and strategies, working towards that September completion of a draft. We've also had engagement with our Forest Trust Lands Advisory Committee and continue to have ongoing meetings with them and other state partner engagement. We have ongoing meetings with other state agencies to help inform the process along the way. Next slide, please. So here's just a little bit of already talked about some of this stuff, but just in summary format. Again, goal development was back in August of 2021. Talked about that public stakeholder partner meetings, November 21 Board of Forestry meeting, and then strategy development from public stakeholder and partner meetings in 2021, and then the March 2022 Board of Forestry meeting, as well as subsequent updates that we've had for strategy consolidation, clarification of intent, connection to themes and the management approach, et cetera. Kind of a summary there of some of that additional work we've done. Go ahead, next slide. Great. We have had, and this has already been largely stated as well, board and forestry engagement along the way. I talked about all this already relative to the board about they approved the guiding principles for the plan, and we've been working with them on just the draft management approach, goals and strategy and guidelines. Again, the opportunities for future direction coming this fall. We're going to provide a completed draft this summer that'll go to them at a board meeting in September, as well as the performance measure development, bringing them some performance measures in the 2023 meeting as well. All right, so pause there.
Great. Thanks so much, Ron, for providing that overview of the forest management plan and kind of the timeline and how the board is being engaged and the engagement with the public and stakeholders and others to date. So in a moment, we want to open it up to Q&A. Before we do that, we do want to get a sense of who's in the room. We won't have time to get to introductions to everyone. It looks like we've got about 94 participants, but we do have a poll that we would love for folks to fill out. So it should have just popped up on your screen. We'd love to kind of get a sense of who's here. So if you just want to let us know, how you identify as conservation group, elected official, are you with a federal or state agency? Are you a member of the public that's listening in? Are you a member of one of the steering or scoping teams that provide guidance on the process? Are you an industry representative, recreation representative, tribes, or something else? And if you have a different other affiliation, feel free to chat that to the host just so we get a sense of that and can document that for our notes. So we'll leave that poll up for a another minute or so. And as people are filling that out, we can go ahead and take down the Q&A and discussion slide and would open it up for questions. So if you have a question on anything you just heard on this forest management plan overview, go ahead and raise your hand. And I think I did hear that the poll might not be working for some folks. So if it's not working for you, let us know. But folks are filling it out. So I think that most people are probably able to see it. All right, I see a hand up from Greg. So Greg, go ahead if you don't mind just saying your name and affiliation if you have one, and go ahead with your question.
Greg Jacob, I'm with the State Forest Advisory Committee. A question for Ron. You mentioned there's a public review this summer. Was that a Zoom review or a letter, email kind of thing? Could you explain that?
Yes, so as we put the draft forest management plan, together, working towards that September meeting for the board, when it goes to the board as a completed draft, it will simultaneously, near simultaneously go out to the public for their awareness and consumption, so that if they would like to engage in comment to the board as they provide deliberation amongst themselves and or feedback to staff at the September meeting, there'll be opportunity to have public comment on that agenda for them. It won't be a specific public comment on the draft work back to staff.
All right, thanks, Greg, for the question. And let's go ahead and end the poll. We can share the results quickly so that other people see as well. Looks like we've got a number of folks here from conservation, federal, state agencies, and general public and industry, kind of generally split amongst those people, and also county elected officials and some recreation and other interests. And I know we also have some members from the Forest Trust Lands Advisory Committee here as well today. So thanks, folks, for joining. All right, if there's other questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. And I also saw some questions come in through the chat from Jen. Jen, I wonder if you wouldn't mind speaking your questions into the group if you want to get some of those on the table. Oh, and it sounds like you're on mute.
Sorry about that. My name is Jen Hammaker. I sit on the board of Oregon Natural Resource Industries, and we're very concerned with the financial impacts, the impact statements to rural communities and jobs. We're also the HCP and the FMP to us, as we've read it, impacts a lot. It's your greatest permanent value. I have a question about that because I don't understand the greatest permanent value. I think it's been changed. It must have been changed recently, because definitely, in my opinion, the FMP and the HCP do not reflect greatest permanent value as far as the economic, environmental, and social impacts. And I would like to know what the actual overarching vision ODF has in mind for our state forests.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we actually have some presentation slides on the overall vision in the FMP coming up shortly. So I think that will help answer the question, but I definitely want to see if Ron, Mike, or Nick, anyone here wants to speak to that here.
Yeah, Jen, if you're going to be able to be with us the whole time, I think that it'd be helpful to get through the presentation and then, see what else that provides to you, and we can then field the question, I think.
Great, thanks so much. I see we have a question from Bodie.
Hey, Ron, Bodie Dowding, Pacific Fiber. I was curious, and I may have missed it. Did you say when you were going to be putting modeled outcomes out to the public?
No, and thank you for mentioning that. So when the draft forest management plan, the completed version, does go to the board in September, it will be accompanied with modeled outcomes of a few different alternatives that could be used in implementation of the forest management plan to help inform, that range of GPV benefits that the board could expect to get from this policy decision.
And then a follow-up, the IP that you're working on, have those modeled outcomes been released, or you know when those will be publicly released, or where could I find them?
Yeah, they are on our website. The modeled outcomes that established our annual harvest objectives in what Mr. Dowding is referring to as our revised implementation plans for our current forest management plan. We had a public meeting last Thursday on the 2nd, and then they went out for public comment on the 3rd for a 30-day public comment period, and they are available on our website. And the annual harvest objective ranges in there are the results of the modeling that we did.
Thank you. I missed that public release somehow, but thank you.
Thanks, Bodie. Jen, another hand up from you. Oh, and you're on mute again.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sylvia. I am wondering what the solvency is going to be for ODF with the FMP and the HCP. I'm sure, Ron, you're going to tell me to wait a couple hours to figure that out. But I'm just wondering what the solvency is. With the HCP, the way that I read it, you guys are going to be struggling to keep the lights on. And the FMP, to me, looks like it is aligning with HCP. And that is also scary. So I'm just wondering if you have an overview of what ODF's financial position is going to be if you implement the current HCP and the current FMP.
Sure. I mean, again, we can talk more about this at the end. We did just share some information on what we call our revised implementation plans, the activity levels that we're going to have for the next 2 fiscal years as we work on finalizing the policy work related to the habitat conservation plan and this forest management plan. And those harvest levels are, approximately, 18 to the low 20%, different. The actual operations haven't been established yet. So it'll be somewhere around, at least 18% lower. And, we have a lot of things that are still not decided, right? In the forest management plan, we don't have the HCP yet. This current trajectory with our revised implementation plan does, obviously bring in somewhat less revenue. We're in a position right now where, as an agency, we have a lot of sold volume that we have out there under contract right now, and we have a reasonably healthy, prudent balance, we call it, in our forest development fund. And what this does is it gives us some time to, as we finalize this policy work, scale expenses to match with the work that we need to do, because our workload will also change. So our costs shouldn't remain, at the level they are today if we're doing less work over time to some extent. Now the work changes in a variety of ways with HCP implementation. We're still working through some of those details, but the general trajectory of since we are 98+% funded through a portion of the timber revenues that we divide, with the counties, there is a decreasing revenue stream trajectory.
So that's also going to impact the counties as well.
Yes, it would impact the counties, proportionally. Now the specific counties are arranged, but yes, it does impact the counties proportionally.
And the HCP is for 70 years. So my 23-year-old is going to be a great grandma before that's over. And then the FMP can change, but how long has it been since we've had this current FMP that we're going off of? And now we're changing it to this one.
Yeah. So this FMP was approved by the board in 2010. So 13 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was a revision of a 2001 plan that generally followed the same management approach, but they just adjusted some levels and at that time. So these are all very legitimate, questions. The specifics around the answers won't be known until we do additional modeling for how we intend to implement the plan. So it is, stay close to the conversation in our work. And as we, finalize the plan and bring new modeled outcomes to the board, with that plan in September, that would be the time to engage.
Well, Ron, but the thing is that in 18 months, we're gonna have a completed FMP, correct?
That's the current timeline, correct? Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, there is still process we obviously have to go through, right? We have to, the board wants to know we need to provide some additional modeled outcomes for them to make the policy choice. That's our planning pathway. That's our intention. And we need to provide them the best information we can to help them inform their decision.
are we sustainable right now?
It depends, but in general, since we're dependent on a portion of the timber revenues, we get 36.25% of the timber revenues, and timber markets are volatile, they're cyclical, and they change over time. So we're really dependent upon stumpage prices, yet some of our other costs we know continue to go up. Personal services costs, other costs around doing business with inflation, consumer price index changes, those are continually trending upwards, and log prices are cyclical. Fortunately, we've had pretty good log prices the last several years, and we've developed a reserve as well as have a fairly reasonable amount of sold wood under contract that will be bringing in some revenue. But long term, we still have a revenue problem with or without an HCP, or with or without this plan. The division still has a revenue problem.
Um,
And
I
Thank-
appreciate what you just said, but I have just one more little question. Are we harvesting sustainably right now?
Absolutely.
Will we be harvesting sustainably if we upped our harvest rate?
That's a variable, right? I don't know how far up means.
What are we harvesting at right now?
Well, roughly we're harvesting, the planning area, I don't know. So Sylvia, I see you're kind of wanting to jump in to move us along. Is that correct?
I do want to make sure we have enough time to get through all the information on the plan moving forward, but if you have a quick response.
Yeah, we're harvesting in the Western Oregon, districts, roughly around 220 to 225 million board feet is what we're planning each year. That's what we put out for sale under plan.
Thank you.
In State Forest, we're very productive. So we represent slightly under 3% of the land base of forest landowners in Oregon, and we produce roughly 10% of the timber that comes off of that less than 3% of the land. So as a forest landowner, we are highly productive in the contribution we make to the forest industry sector.
Thanks,
Thank
Ron.
you.
Thanks, Jen, for the questions to help clarify where we are now. Laura, I see your hand up.
Yeah, maybe you guys are going to cover this, but just real quickly. So Laura Wilkerson with Hampton Lumber. So Ron, you mentioned there's going to be different outcomes or different modeling that's going to be brought to the board for them to make decisions on. So would you kind of style that as different alternatives for them to choose from or take different pieces of? Or I guess, what does that actually look like on paper when you do present that to the board?
Yeah, so we're still working through the actual final model scenarios we'll bring, but it will be how you could approach harvesting differently. Under a forest management plan that's implemented with incidental take permits, it provides us flexibility that we haven't had before. So it provides us, timing flexibility, where we don't have to do surveys for threatened and endangered species that are covered under the HCP. So we've got some flexibility there. And that also gives us some different considerations on how we might approach a larger scale for planning, giving various forest conditions across our districts in the state. And typically we've looked at those under a very narrow singular administrative district and sort of optimizing a non-declining even flow off of that while meeting all the other GPB values and benefits that we are, to provide. So we'll be looking at a couple of different ranges. And then what we call sustainable non-declining even flow means that you can just harvest that level of timber in perpetuity. It's sustainable and shouldn't decline much over time. Obviously, there'll be small fluctuations, but it won't decline much over time. And there's other ways to approach that. You could take volume surplus sooner. You could do that potentially as a choice. If that was something that wanted to be pursued as a transition, over time, while we implement the habitat conservation plan. So there's ranges of things we could do there.
And then sorry, just a quick point. And then the board is going to be able to pick amongst those collectively to then draft into the final FMP.
Well, they'll be giving us, they'll know at that point, they don't set harvest levels, so that's not
Right.
under the purview of the board. But it will present to them a range of options that could be derived from that plan, which is their policy choice to implement GPV. So it would demonstrate the flexibility to realistically achieve that range of outcomes from the plan should they adopt it as policy. And then it's up to staff and the state forester to put that into implementation in an implementation plan. We'll be doing separate modeling for those implementation plans that we'll actually use.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for the questions. Anyone else from ODF want to chime in on any of those questions?
No, I think Ron covered it really well. Actually, maybe the only thing that did occur to me, just so everybody is aware, with our forest management planning processes, by our planning rules, the board actually reviews the plans every 10 years. And can also review them sooner than that if they like. And so none of our forest management plans actually, go longer than 10 years without some kind of review, and the amount of adjustment depends on, well, basically a lot that's going on at the time.
All right, thanks for clarifying that, Mike. Right, well, with that, we'll get into the next part of today's meeting. So we're going to get into the forest management plan components, and we have a few people on ODF staff that are going to provide some information here, mostly on the draft management approach and guidelines that are part of the forest management plan. So I'm going to hand it over to Ron Zilli to kick us off here, and then we'll have Nick and Kevin and Colleen and Tyson on deck to present some of these slides as well. And after that, we'll have another opportunity for Q&A and hear your comments and input. So Ron, over to you.
Sure. Can you go ahead and switch to the next slide? Okay, great. So as Sylvia said, we're going to now spend a little bit more time reviewing in detail the forest management plan components. And they are the introduction, which describes the purpose and the scope of the plan, including the guiding principles, the ownership and location of the lands covered by the plan themes such as greatest permanent value, diversity, equity, inclusion, climate change, sustainability, and adaptive management, and how the FMP relates to other plans and processes, and an outline of the forest management plan chapters. The second component is the management approach chapter, chapter 2, and this provides a vision for how the management of resources is integrated across the landscape and describes the need to adapt management as new information becomes available to sustainably deliver a diverse array of benefits to Oregonians. The next chapter or component is chapter 3, forest resources, goals, and strategies. And this component describes the forest condition to provide context for management. The chapter also includes the forest management plan goals and strategies. The goals are what ODF intends to achieve for each forest resource in the planning area. And the strategies describe how the Oregon Department of Forestry will manage the forest resources and identify management techniques the state forester may use to achieve the plan's goals. And then lastly, we have the guidelines for the forest management plan, which state, general guidelines for asset management, plan implementation, adaptive management, plan revision, and public engagement. Go to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Nick here, who's going to go into great detail on our forest management approach.
I'll try not to go in too great a detail for everybody's benefit, but thanks, Ron. Hey, everybody, my name is Nick Palazzotto. I'm the Resource Support Unit Manager for State Forests. And in the next few slides, I'll try to give a relatively brief primer on our proposed management approach under the new Forest Management Plan. So the management approach is intended to provide a vision for what management will look like across the forest during implementation and what the public will see on the landscape when visiting the forest over time. It's a relatively high level vision for management across the forest to achieve greatest permanent value and address the other major forest management plan themes of sustainability, climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and adaptive management. It's not intended to provide instructions for implementation to the field. Those reside in the goals and strategies themselves, and also in our policies and also our implementation plans. What it does provide is landscape context to address how different areas are managed for different objectives, and the forest as a whole provides for greatest permanent value. Next slide, please. So for those who don't know what greatest permanent value or GPV for short means, it was established in Oregon statute in 1998 and defined as, at that time, as healthy, productive, and sustainable forest ecosystems that over time and across the landscape provide a full range of social, economic, and environmental benefits to the people of Oregon. So I'm going to break that down a little bit. And so the phrase healthy, productive, and sustainable forest ecosystems places emphasis on functional systems and sustainability, which today includes consideration of climate change effects on health and productivity. Over time and across the landscape is an acknowledgement that it takes time to get there. These are, these are still young forests, remember, and that the whole landscape is involved. A full range of social, economic, and environmental benefits is a broad mandate indeed. And it's one that requires consideration of trade-offs at many scales. And the people of Oregon, to the people of Oregon, is also a broad mandate and speaks to the importance of incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations into the division's approach to forest management. This is our common ground. Next slide, please. One way to think about ecosystem function and related social and economic and environmental benefits to the people is in terms of ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services can be categorized into 4 groups. So you have provisioning services. These are resources that the forest ecosystem provide, and they include goods such as food, fuel, and timber. And so just to emphasize, yes, timber is in fact an ecosystem service. Also includes other forest products and mineral resources and services such as clean air and water. There's also regulating services. These, forests help regulate many resources, including water, climate, carbon. There are supporting services. These are similar. They're more process oriented. And so forest ecosystems support the function of many important systems and processes, including nutrient cycling and soil formation, primary productivity, and biodiversity. Cultural services forests provide for recreational, aesthetic, spiritual, and scientific benefits and values, as numerous and diverse as the people that use them. And thus, ecosystem services include all the social, economic, and environmental benefits that are required under greatest permanent value or otherwise desired by the public. An example there might be carbon storage or drinking water. And many of these services are in fact recognized and embedded in greatest permanent value and reflected in the guiding principles for management plans past and present. And managing for ecosystem services provides for community well-being at local and state levels. It's also important to note that in this framework, timber and economic benefits to local communities aren't incompatible with other values or benefits. They are part of the many services that the forest provides. And in our current business model, it's in fact how we pay for all the other benefits and services. Next slide, please. So in addition to identifying many important outcomes that contribute to community well-being, the concept of ecosystem services creates a framework that recognizes how social and economic needs are supported by healthy ecosystems and how society provides services to those ecosystems by supporting their functions. And so that's what this diagram is intended to illustrate, the reciprocal nature of our relationship to the forest ecosystem and the importance of active management in that context. Active management is a key tenet of greatest permanent value. And so, protecting, maintaining, and enhancing ecosystem services is the role that humans play. And then those services provide, benefits and values to us. So on the left side, you have the ecosystem services to Oregonians, and the right side lists some of the many services that humans provide to ecosystems, including cultural and natural resource stewardship, habitat restoration, pest management, and reforestation. This isn't to imply that forest management is just about ecological function, but ecological function is key to the sustainable provision of these services through time. And this is particularly relevant within the context of climate change and promoting resilience in managed forests. Next slide. So under this new forest management plan, we will use what we are calling an ecologically sustainable approach to forest management. The term comes from existing literature, in particular, a 2012 paper by an international team of scientists that frames up retention forestry in the same context. The table presented here is adapted from their work and modified to reflect state forest considerations. So an ecologically sustainable approach to forest management is about ecosystem services and about promoting resilience to address uncertainty and risk. This approach to forest management is to sustain and support the ecological integrity and productivity of the forest, and thereby improve resilience and capacity to adapt to change over time. Key to this approach is active management for multiple values at multiple scales. And this figure is intended to illustrate how ecologically sustainable forest management can be used to promote healthy, resilient, productive, and sustainable forest ecosystems by managing at multiple scales. Where am I? Okay, so on the left, we have conservation areas to ensure habitat protection. These are distributed across the landscape, which improves resilience and function. In the middle, we reference some of the considerations for landscape management, including compositional and structural diversity, which are both important concepts of resilient forests, habitat connectivity, but also location of harvest units and roads, and more sort of operational considerations. And then on the right, we list some stand level considerations, including young stand management, type of harvest, retention of biological legacies, and pest management. And these are by no means exhaustive lists, but through consideration of these multiple values at multiple scales, we work to ensure sustainable provision of greatest permanent value and the associated ecosystem services. Again, timber and economic benefits to local communities are ecosystem services. And in our business model, timber revenue is the primary vehicle to pay for all the others. This is not in conflict with this management approach. It's just important context for state forest management. An ecologically sustainable forest management approach can and will look different on different ownerships, like federal, state, or private, contingent on the mandates for that land base. The fundamental premise here is that healthy, diverse, productive, and resilient forests maintain and enhance ecosystem services and the varied benefits the public derives from them, and are the foundation upon which a sustainable working forest model is built. Next slide, please. Specific management strategies to increase resilience to climate change or other disturbances and the trade-offs considered will vary across the landscape depending on the specific emphasis of particular areas as designated by the Forest Management Plan, the Habitat Conservation Plan, our forest land management classification system, and other laws and policies. The management approach describes how strategies to improve resilience and adaptive capacity vary according to emphasis by framing it within the context of the forest land management classification system, FLMCS for short. And the FLMCS is defined in Oregon Administrative Rule, and describes the type of management that will apply to a particular area of the land base and the appropriate range of activities for these areas and the forest resources that the classification is intended to address. So it's a useful vehicle for framing the management approach. On state forest lands, timber revenue funds the majority of management activities. And these funds are also the primary vehicle for providing economic benefits to rural communities across the state. An emphasis on production-oriented goals and related silvicultural strategies will therefore take priority on a significant portion of the landscape through time. Production of timber will be the primary objective in most general stewardship lands. However, it's also important to note that general stewardship lands managed for timber also provide for other ecosystem services, such as clean water, carbon sequestration, and wildlife habitat. Another category in the FLMCS is high value conservation areas, or HVCAs for short. And these are intended to be managed for a specific conservation value. Forest management may be conducted to the extent that the activities promote the conservation values and are consistent with applicable legal requirements and will avoid long-term adverse impacts to the specified conservation value. That is a very long sentence. Habitat conservation areas and riparian conservation areas designated under the Habitat Conservation Plan are examples of these HVCAs. Focused stewardship lands, one or more specific resource require heightened or focused awareness, and additional management strategies are designed to maintain and protect these resources. Examples include cultural resources and recreation sites. I should say there's a lot of overlap among categories. Special use areas are managed for a specified forest use. Integrated management activities conducted on these lands are limited to those that are compatible with the specific use. So Tillamook Forest Center is an example of that, or utility rights of way. Recreation and education and interpretation program really sits on top of all of these emphasis areas and is interwoven throughout the landscape. The difference among these emphasis areas provides for diverse recreational activities and experiences, as well as opportunities to educate the public about both sustainable working forests and functional forest ecosystems. In this framework, the types and proportions of services that any given acre contributes will depend on the landscape context, but the forest as a whole provides the full suite of services that the public demands from state forests. And in this manner, the entire forest is a working forest, both in the traditional sense and within the broader context of GPP. Next slide. That is all. So I think I pass it back to Ron now.
Great. Thank you, Nick, for that. A lot of information, there on the management approach. So appreciate that. Next, we're going to go into the FMP guidelines. So just going to give you an overview, and I'll turn it over to Kevin Boyd, who's going to go into some more detail. But the guidelines chapter describes the processes for how the Western Oregon State Forest Management Plan are going to be implemented, revised, and how we're going to engage with the public in these process. The guidelines also generally describe how assets are going to be maintained or enriched, and how spending is going to be prioritized to achieve the resource management goals and strategies. Additionally, the guidelines describe the elements actually, they're not additionally, I've already talked about plan implementation, adaptive management process, et cetera. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin, who's going to go into more detail on our asset management guidelines. Kevin?
Yes, next slide, please. There you go. Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Boyd, State Forest Division's Asset Unit Manager. In the Forest Management Plan, assets are combined to the tangible resources and infrastructure, which includes parcels of land, forest products, forest roads and related improvements, trails, and campground facilities on state forest lands. Maintaining or enhancing value for assets is fundamental to long-term sustainability of resource values described in greatest permanent value rule, such as timber, revenue, aquatic and wildlife habitat, and recreation. Next slide. Funding levels for plan implementation vary with cyclical economic trends. Forest management plan implementation is primarily funded through timber harvest revenues. There may be periods where revenues limit funding. Annual budget instructions for developing fiscal budgets reflect the Forest Development Fund balance and projected Forest Development Fund balance. The Forest Development Fund is an operating account where state forest funds are deposited and are available for ODF to manage Board of Forestry lands for greatest permanent value. The highest funding level of implementation is when the Forest Development Fund balance exceeds 12 months of operating expenses and the balance is forecast to increase. The lowest funding level occurs when the Forest Development Fund balance is less than 6 months of operating expenses and the balance is forecasted to decrease. External funding sources should be considered at investment level 2 and pursued if investment level is projected to be at level 3 or level 4. I'll now pass next slide to Colleen Kaiser.
All right, great. Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colleen Kaiser, and I'm the State Forest Planning Manager. Today, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about the forest management guidelines for implementation. As we mentioned before, the Forest Management Plan identifies the resource management goals and strategies. It does not focus on a single objective, but it considers several key social, environmental, and economic goals at different scales. Land managers are tasked with considering all of the goals and strategies, identifying and addressing trade-offs, and meeting greatest permanent value when implementing the Forest Management Plan. Implementation of this plan relies on many tools and processes, and I will spend the next few minutes talking about the major ones shown on this slide. First on the list is the Habitat Conservation Plan. This plan enables ODF to comply with the Federal Endangered Species Act for certain covered species while conducting land management activities on state forests west of the Cascades. During the development of the Habitat Conservation Plan, land managers and partners identified and provided feedback on a multitude of trade-offs. As a result, the biological goals and objectives in the Habitat Conservation Plan reflect these decisions, which will then be used by land managers to guide implementation of forest operations. Next on the list is performance measures. The performance measures are being developed along with the Forest Management Plan with direct input from the Board of Forestry and will continue specific metrics and targets. These performance measures will be monitored and will provide the essential dashboard for the Board of Forestry and others to track progress towards the forest management goals and to maintain accountability for management commitments during implementation. Next, I'd like to talk about the operational policies. When planning and implementing forest operations, there are many instances where different management options exist that will achieve the Forest Management Plan goals and strategies. Operational policies guide decisions within this range of options by defining specific procedures and best management practices that allow for management flexibility while ensuring sound management and resource protection. These policies and standards provide the framework for land managers to develop both implementation and operations plans and to work through on-the-ground trade-off discussions. Next, I will talk a little bit about the forest land management classification system. As Nick talked about this during the management approach discussion. This system is a method of describing the management emphasis of parcels of state forest land and is required by law. The management emphasis identifies the extent to which a parcel of land can be managed for a variety of forest resources. It also identifies when a particular forest resource may need a more focused approach in its management, or possibly an exclusive priority in its management as designated by the Forest Management Plan, the Habitat Conservation Plan, and other laws and commitments. This information is used in the development of implementation plans and also during operational planning. Another tool we use for implementation is modeling. Models are used as a decision support tool to evaluate trade-offs and objective levels at various spatial and temporal scales, and the costs and outputs associated with each scenario. Modeling aids forest managers to evaluate effects and make decisions to allocate resource cross uses. I have talked a little bit about implementation plans above, but I wanted to give a little bit more context. Implementation plans are mid-range plans that can cover anywhere from an 8 to 12-year period, and will include the description of current condition of forest resources, types and general locations of plan management activities, and set objective and targets to provide progress towards forest management plan goals and strategies and the habitat conservation plan goals and objectives. These implementation plans will provide the linkages between all of the tools I have talked about on this list and the on-the-ground activities that are described in the operations plans. Trade-off considerations are assessed and considered at the landscape level and then incorporated into the implementation plans to provide guidance for the types and amounts of activities to be included in the operations plans. The operations plan describe individual projects for achieving expected forest management plan and habitat conservation plan outcomes over a 1 to 2 year period. They are also developed to align with fiscal budgets and implementation plan targets and objectives. Operation plans prioritize activities and investments in the forests like inventory, young stem management, and recreation development based on implementation levels outlined in the forest management plan asset guidelines that Kevin talked about in the previous slide. The final items on this list are the adaptive management plan and monitoring plans, which also play a role in forest management plan implementation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tyson to discuss these in more detail.
Thanks, Colleen. Hi all, I'm Tyson Webrick. I'm the Adaptive Management and Monitoring Specialist at State Forests. And I was in charge of drafting the adaptive management guidelines. So in rule, adaptive management is the process of improving our management through monitoring the outcomes of the FMP strategies in a scientific manner. And the guidelines outline what this process looks like in terms of decision-making, monitoring, and research. One change compared to the last FMP is that we describe adaptive management as a tool within the broader scope of decision-making. And the reason for this is that if the steps for making a decision and the role of adaptive management are not clear beforehand, it can lead to monitoring for the sake of monitoring without actually applying the new knowledge to our management decisions. So adaptive management, in a narrow sense, is primarily used for decisions in which uncertainty makes the outcome unknowable without monitoring alternative management. And the experiments or monitoring within adaptive management can then reduce the uncertainty of future decisions. And so that narrow definition of adaptive management has shortcomings in that it doesn't incorporate a diversity of values inherent in public land management, and it doesn't always lead to improved management decisions. Next slide, please. So in these guidelines, we show how adaptive management fits within structured decision-making, which is the predominant process in natural resource management for making complex multi-objectives decisions, and that emphasizes group deliberation, acknowledges different values, estimates outcomes of alternative actions, and clarifies the choices upon which the decision maker can act. And this decision loop can happen at different levels of our organization. The decision maker could be someone in the field. It could be, the Board of Forestry. And the process complexity and input will scale with that. And during this process, a group may decide that adaptive management is needed or monitoring is needed to test our management alternatives to find the best outcome if there's high uncertainty about the consequences. Next slide, please. The adaptive management plan is also outlined in the guidelines. And this plan is outside of the forest management plan. It's going to be the process in which we implement the actions listed in these 4 bullets. And the reason it's outside the forest management plan is because it needs to be a living document that's continuously updated as new monitoring projects are started and as new results need to be reported. It could serve a variety of decision support needs and information needs within state forests, but at least for the next few years, we anticipate that it will primarily be tasked with monitoring and reporting for the habitat conservation plan and for performance measures for the Board of Forestry. The habitat conservation plan has its own chapter on adaptive management and monitoring that will be integrated into the adaptive management plan. Specific monitoring plans will also be tracked within the adaptive management plan, and that will provide the who, the what, where, when, and how for each monitoring project. And monitoring plans would include projects derived from the habitat conservation plan and from the forest management plan. Next slide, please.
All right, I think it's back to me, Tyson.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm going to just walk through some of the FMP guidelines that discuss public engagement for the supporting, planning or implementation planning elements of the forest management plan. So with the adaptive management plan that Tyson was just talking about, the public can engage with the Board of Forestry when they're discussing performance measures for forest management planning on their agendas is the appropriate time to engage in that conversation. For our implementation plans, things that are helpful when those are out for public review are, the levels and types of plan management activities contained within those implementation plans, the priorities and general locations of plan management activities, and then tiering down to our operational plans, the district level plans, suggestions on how to improve efficiencies and effectiveness, clarify how planned operations are described, and or offer solution-oriented comments to further achieve greatest permanent value there. Just want to touch on some of those elements on how public can engage at various levels in the planning process. So turn it over to Sylvia now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron and Tyson, Colleen, Nick, and Kevin for presenting on the different pieces of the forest management plan components. We want to get into some Q&A and discussion. And before we do, I just want to make a note. We put a few links in the chat. So just for context, you got a link to the 2020 study that was used to help guide the plan. So that's in the chat here. And then also in the chat, you have links to the draft management approach as well as the draft guidelines. So these are kind of 2 draft pieces of the FMP that you can look at. They're, a longer version of what you just saw presented, but if you want to see more of the detail, please feel free to look at those links after today's meeting. And as we head into Q&A, would love to see if people have questions. Just go ahead and raise your hand, press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. And as folks are getting their questions together, while Nick was presenting on the management approach, we got a number of questions in the chat about the climate change and carbon strategy. So I'm going to attempt to coalesce those into one multi-part mega question for ODF because it might be easier to answer them all together. And if folks ask these questions and you feel like it wasn't sufficiently captured, please ask the follow-up questions. But generally questions around, does the climate change strategy in the FMP consider carbon that's released by forest fires? And does it consider carbon that's sequestered in timber that's harvested and milled? And then also around whether ODF will commit to ensuring that forests will be a significant carbon sink. And there was also some concern about as trees get older, they may not sequester as much carbon and whether that's being considered in the plan. So just going to put that out there. And of course, folks, follow up if that wasn't captured correctly on kind of the climate change and carbon questions. I see Mike has a response.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Tyson and others have better answers on some of the more technical questions, but I did want to lead off with the question regarding whether or not will the FMP commit to ensuring these forests are a significant carbon sink? And I think the question there is the significance of it, right? And so considering the landscape design that will be in the FMP and the fact that it does have the HCP underpinning it, has a significant contribution from the habitat conservation areas and riparian conservation areas. Now, again, that plan is designed to provide for the covered species, and that is the purpose of an HCP. However, it obviously has certain ancillary benefits. We believe, and we still need to show through the modeling, for the FMP, that will create a net carbon sink on state forest lands in terms of carbon stored on the forest specifically, as part of that management. Now, the question in front of the board with the remainder of the area and scenarios that they'll be asked to evaluate and provide feedback on, direction to us on, in the intervening areas outside of conservation areas, that's really up to them to provide that direction on their expectations. And different board members have different opinions, but we do not know their direction currently as a board on that, and they won't want to weigh in on that until they see some of the modeled outcomes for the FMP. So that's what I can tell you there. There's also the question of whether or not, it looks like it came up a couple of times, as to whether or not harvested wood products will be considered in the carbon equation, and they will. Specifically, we look at it in two ways here. There's different levels of influence that we have as a forest manager over carbon. We have very direct control over how much carbon we're growing on the stump. That's just, pretty obvious. How much we grow versus harvest, we have a lot of control over that. We have a fair amount of control then on what we choose to harvest. We have, not necessarily control, but a pretty good idea of the kinds of products that are going to be made. And so we can have an estimation there of what is stored in harvested wood products. And then in terms of there's oftentimes questions further out around substitution in terms of, for those who aren't familiar with the term, it's just, if you're not using wood, you're using something else, concrete, steel, something perhaps more carbon intensive. Given the share of the market that ODF really plays in, we have much less control over substitution, and substitution will not be directly reported out from the modeling. So I guess I will leave it there for those questions and turn it over to someone else around some of the other questions. Thanks.
I'll take a crack at the question around sequestration rate. So yeah, my understanding of the science is that younger trees sequester at a faster rate. I'm not sure if that translates to more. And also bigger trees, more storage. So, there's a difference between sequestration and storage. It's an important difference. But yes, we are thinking about all of those different elements, I guess is the short answer. Tyson, back cleanup if you have anything.
No, Nick, I mean, that sounds fine. I think that our modeling accounts for the different rates of sequestration and storage of different stand ages.
Okay. Thanks, Tyson and Nick. And does anybody at the at the agency have any thoughts on the question around forest fires and whether the climate change strategy considers carbon released by forest fires?
Not in terms of like annual budget accounting, like carbon budget accounting, but we are thinking about management actions both to reduce fire risk and to improve the resilience of forests post disturbance. That's a short answer.
All right, thanks, Nick. And to the folks who asked those questions in the chat, does that any follow-up or any other questions there? And Ron, did you want to add something?
No, I'm just trying to keep up with all the questions and see where I can add in if I need to, but.
I will add, and there seems to be a couple of maybe follow-on questions that have popped up regarding the value of older stands in storage and sequestration. And yes, that is being considered. It's primarily, I mean, it will be reflected in the modeling, as Tyson said, looking at different stand ages and those outcomes as they grow. Specific to the planning piece, where we are starting again is with the older forests that will develop inside of habitat conservation areas and riparian conservation areas.
Thanks, Mike.
I have a.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Jen, and then we'll head over to Susanna.
I'm sorry, this is to Nick, I think, probably. So you just said that you're thinking about mitigation and strategy on how to, resilience towards the forests. Is thinning included in that?
Yeah, indeed. So, various fuels reduction techniques, both on the forest floor and in the overstory. And so thinning is certainly a component of that. Both inside the conservation areas and outside, although sort of the prescriptions or the approach in the conservation areas will likely look different than outside.
Is that included in the 18% reduction in harvest levels?
The fuels reduction, no, I don't think so. Somebody else chime in if I'm wrong, but no, we're not accounting for fuels mitigation strategies in harvest modeling.
No.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Susanna and then Trygve. And if folks are putting questions in the chat, we would maybe prefer that you raise your hand and ask them so that we can make sure to get to everything. So to Susanna and then Trygve.
Hi, thank you for taking this is more of a comment on a narrative that small trees sequester carbon faster than big trees. And yes, if you start with a seedling and you think of a pencil and it goes to a 30-year-old tree, which has a circumference that's a fraction of a 50 or 60-year-old tree, it's still from a pencil to the size of a 30-year-old tree. Yes, it's much more. When you consider a 50, 60, 70-year-old tree circumference, which really represents the amount of wood putting down every year, there's a huge difference of every year how that circumference piece of cellulose, i.e. carbon, is put down by the tree. So to me, it's a total false narrative to equate the faster growing small tree for percentage of size versus the way a large tree grows, lays down basically carbon, the cellulose, and yes, their percentage of growth slows down, but the amount of actual wood that's laid down is incredibly more than a young tree. And saying that, well, if we do trees, we don't have cement and all that carbon from cement, to me is also a very tricky road to go down. And we don't try to do those. I don't think ODF should be trying to do the comparisons, as many industry people say, well, let's cut the trees down because they create less carbon. And you know, those are my comments. Before, I just want to say earlier on, I put it in chat wanting the greatest permanent value ruling. The law that was written, what, 70, 80 years ago? I don't know, but it's very, very clear. The goals are very clear. It says no one goal will supersede another goal. And it's such a nice, clear to the point ruling and not very long that I think all discussion should start with that. And then I think the way that it was elaborated was good at the meeting, but it almost seems like, well, it's you can kind of massage it and change it a little, which the law is very clear. And so those are my comments, really. They're more comments than questions, but thank you for letting me express them.
Thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate that. All right, over to Trygve.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just amplify what Susanna just said, which is to say, the carbon sequestration capability of an 80-year-old tree totally dwarfs anything a smaller stand of trees can accomplish, because you're not only dealing with the circumferential growth of that tree, but you also have a much taller tree implementing the fixation of carbon dioxide. So I think it's really, really fundamental to really take care of the carbon sequestration capability of our state forests in relation to the whole dynamic of carbon. The other thing I wanted to raise was, I'm wondering, in relation to all the things that have been said, how steep slope protections will be accomplished in relation to facilitating protection of water, because the State Forest Practices Act and related new rules that are being promulgated, I'm really confident from the experience I've seen in the field that steep slopes are being logged very routinely in ways that significantly jeopardize the water, the crucial water that streams are providing. And water is certainly a very fundamental resource that we need to be protecting. So I'm curious what you can say about that. Thank you.
Nick, would you want to take that?
I was going to take carbon and give somebody else water. On the carbon piece, Trygve, I think so. If we vision it out, right, you've got approximately half the forest in conservation areas between the habitat, the terrestrial and the riparian. Those are getting more mature through time. So they're both sequestering carbon and storing increasing amounts of carbon. There's management out there too, but it's got to be offset by that. The rest of the landscape where we're managing for like with a production emphasis is also largely sequestering carbon. Those young stands are sequestering at higher rates, whether it's a higher amount or not. Combined with that is why we think we're likely in a sink scenario. And that's not to discount the role of any of those individual stands in the sequestration and storage cycle.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I can weigh in specifically on the aquatics piece. And so, in terms of steep slope protections, it's primarily what's there in the HCP currently, which allows for buffering of potential debris flow tracks and initiation sites of a certain risk level. And so, one of the important things I think to realize about that, number one, is there's the protection of the slope during operations, but then I think just as importantly, and this has always been a core piece of what we've done under our current forest management plan, really, is leaving that material there when that slope fails ensures that wood is delivered and not just sediments of various sizes. Not that sediments aren't important. I think there's a lot of focus on fine sediment that gets into these systems, but the underlying cobble and gravel also come from, those sources. And then also the wood that comes in there is extremely important. As I think everybody knows, most people know, we are dealing with wood deficient systems. And a large part of the capacity of those systems to store water, appropriately filter sediment and so forth, and provide off-channel habitat and everything is reduced by the fact there's not much wood there. So when that wood gets in there, it does help with that. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we want to do. Restoration projects are always part of what we do, but we really do want to set the system up so that it has the components when there is slope failure, that it actually provides the function as well. So in terms of, that's the primary driver there. And actually, I don't know if anybody else has anything to say about perhaps drinking water specific strategies in the FMP, but I just wanted to hit the steep slopes piece there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Trygve and Nick. And I'm just taking a look at the time here. We do want to save time today for the update on the Western Oregon Habitat Conservation Plan and the NEPA process. Don't want to shortchange that because I know a lot of people are interested in that update. So let's take the hands that are up from Chuck and from Jen, and then we'll save the other questions for kind of our final hour from 3 to 4, if that's okay. So Chuck, over to you.
Yeah, I have a question about the future modeling, or the modeling of future timber growth or forest growth, sequestering of carbon under various possible scenarios of climate change. What scenario or what assumptions of future climate 20, 30, and 40 years out is the agency using relative to its modeling?
Yeah. So Chuck, I'll take a stab at this and then let others, weigh in if they would like to. We have to do extrapolations of the outcomes of growth of our forests and the different, compositions of the forest that we have. The model itself, I don't think is tempered, that we're using is not tempered. We're using a harvest scheduler for the upcoming modeling, so it doesn't, factor in climatic change relative to the growth there directly in the model. So we have to basically post-process assumptions, after we get the range of outputs from the modeling. And I'd be happy to hear if anyone else has anything to add there on our team.
Well, I could add something. The Forest Service Forest Vegetation Simulator has a climate version that is empirically tested against the IPC directories, and you could use that simulator to model forest stands under various scenarios, and it's already done for Western US forest. You might reference it.
I see it. Todd, did you have anything you wanted to add? I saw you turn your camera on there.
Well, I think Chuck just gonna mention it. Sorry, I'm Todd Herron. I'm the forest resource analyst with State Forests. As Chuck mentioned, we're aware that the FVS has a climate module extension. We're not currently implementing that. So just I think that's the answer is that we currently don't have a climate trajectory embedded in the growth modeling.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Jen, last question from you before we move on.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Number one, old trees are, as Suzanne was saying, old trees are carbon storage. They're not so much the carbon sequestration. So if they burn, they will release more carbon than younger stands, number one. Number two, the GPV, the greatest permanent value, supposed to be equally separated or equally distributed between the social, economic, and environmental. But the HCP is impacting 640,000 acres, which is about 2/3 of the acres that ODF manages, if I'm not mistaken. So that's not equal, first of all. Second of all, the HCP defines forest fires as a disturbance. And that's contrary to what I believe and have been taught. So just saying,
No.
the HCP is impacting 640,000 acres of our state forests. Over 400,000 is going to be shut down to conservation areas and aquatic conservation areas. That's a lot. To me, that's not greatest permanent value. To me, that is disproportionately towards the environment, and aligns, and the FMP aligns itself with HCP. So
I just want to provide a couple comments in response to that. So one, appreciate, what you're saying. Just a real specific point around the GPV administrative rule itself. Nowhere in the rule does it specify that there has to be, an equal balance of social, economic, and environmental benefits. And that's what the board's job is, really. They're there to represent the diverse, citizenry of Oregon, and they're to decide in policy, what levels they would like to get they're the ones that do the balancing to come up with the policy that derives the benefits that they think is best suited for all Oregonians, and that's what their role is. So it isn't clear, it isn't in the rule, just so you're clear there. And then within the the HCP planning area or permit area, that's the total acreage, but it isn't all constrained by conservation commitments. There's 300,000 acres that is in what we call basically this general stewardship land that we will be managing, very actively. And there's also allowable activities for management within the habitat conservation areas for the first 30 years. That does include healthy conifer thinning and does include some regeneration harvesting of certain types of stands. So roughly 2,500 acres of activity per year for the first 30 years is written into the current draft of the HCP. So it does include active management within those conservation strategies. And then there's 300,000 acres within that permanent area that's within the forest management plan that is will be intended to be actively managed.
Thank you, Ron and Jen. Okay, well, with that, let's move into the update on the Western Oregon Habitat Conservation Plan and the National Environmental Policy Act update. So I'm going to hand it over to Cindy Kolomachuk to kick us off here.
Thank you, Sylvia, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cindy Kolomachuk, the project manager for the Western Oregon State Forest HCP, and I will provide a brief update on the NEPA and HCP processes, and then I'll turn it over to Nick Palazzotto for updates on the HCP. Next slide, please. Okay, so the timeline that you see here shows the HCP in green and the NEPA process in blue. The circles at the top of each line indicate major milestones, and those that are yellow indicate formal engagement with the Board of Forestry. And I'm just going to hit the highlights here, but now you kind of have a map, so you can choose your own adventure. And of course, ask any questions that you might want to when we're done here. Now, as Ron mentioned earlier, the Board of Forestry directed staff to move the draft HCP into the NEPA process at their board meeting in October of 2020. And you can see here that this began in March 2021 with the launch of the public scoping process and the release of the administrative draft of the HCP shortly thereafter in April. The next big step was the release of the draft environmental impact statement. We also call that the DEIS, and the public draft HCP. This launched a public comment period on both documents from March 18th, 2022 to June 1st, 2022. Many of you participated in that process and really appreciate your feedback. NOAA Fisheries received over 400 comments on the DEIS and the HCP, all of which are available at regulations.gov. We do have a link to regulations.gov on our HCP website, and I'll just ask Ellen or Jason to provide that in the chat. That would be great. And also just a reminder to folks that We did provide an update on the public comment on the HCP to the Board of Forestry in September last year, so just a few months ago. Now, because the services received so many public comments, they're still processing them. And it did kind of extend their timeline that they thought that they were going to need for processing public comments, but it has not affected the overall timeline, so that is good. They are continuing to work towards the final environmental impact statement and integrating these comments into that. We anticipate that the final environmental impact statement will be released in June of 2023, and this will include all of the responses to comments, as well as a summary of changes from the draft environmental impact statement to the final environmental impact statement. Now, up top on the HCP side, we've also been integrating public comment and working with the scoping team to refine the HCP. And for those of you that are new to the process, the scoping team is consisting of all of the state and federal wildlife agencies, as well as DEQ, and sometimes OSU works with us in the scoping team. So we've been working with them in finalizing the HCP, and we plan to have that final HCP ready for editing and publishing in April. That will be released with the final environmental impact statement in June. So those two documents come out together as part of the NEPA process. The last step in the NEPA process is publishing the record of decision. We anticipate that will happen in July. And at that time, we will know if the HCP meets incidental take permit issuance criteria. The last step is that September Board of Forestry meeting in 2023 that Ron spoke to earlier. And at that meeting, the Board of Forestry will determine whether to implement the HCP and associated incidental take permits in combination with the forest management plan. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, we've been refining the HCP since the release of the public draft last March. These refinements include responses to comments that we received on the public draft HCP, clarifying some of the language and intent of that language, and streamlining the monitoring and reporting process as we have an eye towards implementation. Now, unfortunately, because the HCP is now in the federal process, we're not able to make the final HCP publicly available prior to that June release. However, we will provide a summary of changes to date today, and these will be posted on our website by the end of the week. And we will also update that summary of changes document in April when the final HCP is complete. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Nick for an update on those summary of changes.
Thanks, Cindy. So just a few quick high-level updates on recent edits to the HCP. Most of the edits are relatively small, but important nonetheless, and relate mainly to clarifying or refining language or updating estimates where we have improved information. So chapter 3 describes the covered activities, and those are the activities for which the incidental take permit would be issued. And we've made a few key changes there, including adding fish salvage as a covered activity. And so this came up when we were looking at bridge construction, bridge replacement, and like dewatering of streams and etc. Another is we updated language on the expected number of new roads and trails over the permit term. This is something we've been working on for a while now, just trying to make sure our numbers reflect our anticipated growth through time in a way that gives us the flexibility we need. And then we also added further clarification around quarries, borrow sites, and stockpile sites in riparian areas. Next slide, please. Chapter 4 describes the specific conservation actions that we're taking for the covered species. On the terrestrial side, we added language clarifying intent to conduct barred owl management. The language was already there. We just sort of made sure it was up at the forefront because there seemed to be some confusion about whether or not we were committing to barred owl management. So just making very clear that we are and what the nature of that commitment is. And then we also added some, or just refined the language around terrestrial species habitat enhancements, which is, I forget which conservation action, but sort of down low on the, or, towards the end of the list of actions we take for the covered species. On the aquatic side, we added language related to special considerations for potentially unstable slopes, and then added a related figure just to really for clarity. We provided additional management direction and best management practices for seasonal other streams and the equipment restriction zone. And this was always intended, but a request from NOAA. And so we just sort of fleshing out that information. We updated the beaver management section to include references to the latest science. So like some papers have come out since we started work on the HCP. So just made sure we were still aligned and pointing to best available. And then we also updated the fish passage section to include both the 2022 National Marine Fisheries Service fish passage requirements and ODFW's fish passage requirements. The 2022 requirements obviously came out post facto in terms of HCP development. Next slide. And then, so things we're still working on, we're currently working through the monitoring and reporting requirements, which are in chapter 6, I believe. There's a lot of them. And so we're just kind of working through them with the services to ensure that we're all aligned on data collection and, so what information is needed and when, and then also the like, where are there redundancies? Because there's a lot of requirements and it's like, which actually are the same, but said differently in different places. So just kind of working through and cleaning that up. And then we're updating the appendices as well to include additional data and information just in support of the HCP, and it runs the gamut of types of info. That's it. I think back to you, Cindy.
Back to me. Great, thanks so much, Nick and Cindy, for that update. So want to open it up now to Q&A on anything you heard about the process for the Habitat Conservation Plan and the NEPA process and these changes to the draft HCP since that March 2022 release. All right, so just raise your hand if you have any questions. We'll go first to Joe and then to Michael. And just a reminder also to introduce yourself and your affiliation if you have one, if you are speaking for the first time.
Thank you, Sylvia. My name's Joe Barker, and I'm not truly a tree hugger, but I do admire a good, well-maintained forest and do get concerned over forest fires. My question actually deals with pesticide usage. I understand there's a necessity for it, but I'm also concerned about bees and if the pesticides used would be sympathetic to the bee colonies.
Do we have one of our resident pesticide experts on staff here? I'm not seeing our go-to guy.
I can take a shot at that. And so, I want to make, so I appreciate that question. I appreciate the sentiment. We do use, obviously, ODF does use herbicide treatments as part of our reforestation young stand management strategies. However, we try to only use it to, the point where we really need it. And that's sort of being refined all the time. In terms of the types that are being used, everything we do is in with everything we use is of course coordinated with ODA, and we comply with all of those things. in terms of finding what's most practical in the future and also what's most cost effective, I can't really give you any rote prescription of how things might turn out, but we're certainly going to be looking to what's most cost effective for us to do, regardless of the policy context and so forth. And so as we move forward, and there's been a lot of focus on early seral complex habitats more recently, and the effect that has on pollinators and pollinator health. And so it is all part of the equation. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you right now. And we don't have anybody available actually that speaks directly to the herbicides specifically. But just so you have some context there on how we kind of evaluate that going forward. So it is a process of continual improvement. And I don't think that we're necessarily alone in that as a forest manager.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the answer, but I've always been under the impression that herbicides and pesticides are two different things. And yeah, it is unfortunate that your herbicide pesticide guy isn't available, or gal. But I do appreciate the answer, and I'm glad there is a consciousness towards that. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, over to you, and then to Laura.
Hi, everyone. Michael Lang with the Wild Salmon Center. I apologize. I had a conflicting meeting, so I missed the first part of the presentation, but big shout out and thanks to the staff for a good presentation from what I saw. I did get sort of cut off on the first part. I had some forest management plan questions. Is it appropriate to ask those now?
At this point, we want to focus on the HCP, and then at 3 o'clock, we'll have time for any other questions on any of these topics.
Sure, that's fine. As long as you come back to me then, that's perfect. I'll jump to the HCP questions too. There is a reference to management activities in the HCAs. I'm wondering if the department can share an estimate of any acreage on what those treatments would be in the HCAs, the type of volume you'd be looking at for extraction on a periodic basis, maybe an annual basis. And where is the department as far as establishing guidelines for any habitat work? And it'd have to be related to restoring habitat, right, in the HCAs. Any guidelines for those activities? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start that, and I think somebody else will probably come behind and clean it up. But so the HCP allows for up to 75,000 acres of management activities, harvest activities inside the habitat conservation areas. That's about 27% of the area they're in, and it's about 12% of the total permit area. Within that, it breaks out to 45,000 acres thinning of healthy healthy conifer stands, and 15,000 acres of regeneration harvest of Swiss needlecast stands, and 15,000 acres of conversion of alder dominated stands to conifer dominated stands through regeneration harvest. So about 30,000 acres regen harvest, 45,000 acres thinning. Prescriptions therein. So we're not talking about a straight clear cut. We're talking, there are some pretty specific prescriptions for the Swiss needlecast. It's basically remove only the Swiss needlecast infested trees, and actually in some cases leave some of them. And so that would target Doug fir, leave everything else. The alder stands, it's target the alder, leave everything else. So you have a relatively high level of retention, and one that over the long term promotes structure. Structure being a surrogate for habitat. The prescriptions for thinning also, they run the gamut. There may be areas that we're thinning pretty heavily. There may be areas that we're doing variable density thinning. There may be the occasional straight commercial thin, and there may be pole thins, which are relatively light. All of which where we have confidence that taking action will promote habitat and do so in a timely manner. And so along those lines, we've set a pace and scale around that there was a lot of concern from the scoping team, from the services around the pace. So how fast are we going to go in there and do all that work? And then concern on our part that if we do this work, we want to see the benefits within the permit term and the scoping team as well. So all of that is to occur within the first 30 years of the permit term, so that those stands are showing habitat gains at the back end. And then we sort of dictated how much can occur in a given year to address the services concerns around the pace there. And then we additionally carved out a little space to say, hey, depending on how this is going and on how much else is out there, we want to be able to talk about doing more than that farther out in the permit term. So if the services are like, wow, those treatments are really doing what we thought they were going to do, and we have more candidate stands and there's support across the board, we would go back in and do more.
And regarding the volume per year too, that was, sorry, it was a multiple point question.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I
But
can
it was
talk
a question about volume.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So for right now, that's kind of where, when we were talking about the different plan levels, that'll be in our implementation plan levels. Like as we get through the FMP and the HCP processes and some general modeling, we'll have some outcomes there, but the specific targets would be set in our implementation plans. That would be, we would be developing once the HCP and the FMP were approved.
The volume will
So
be
just-
lower than like our sort of, classic clear cut today. So when we regen harvest a stand today, generally in our target age of 70 to 90, that volume's obviously going to be a lot bigger than a Swiss needle cast, regen harvest of sort of underdeveloped stands, or even just a thinning of a healthy stand.
This clarification, is that with the IP, with the harvest projections, has that been incorporated into the current projections that you presented last Thursday? And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, they have not. So we for the ones that I presented on Thursday, we are just looking at opportunities during this transition period because the planning processes start about 2 years before we actually start doing work on those plans. So those were already in place a couple of years ago as we work through them, because we're still under take avoidance and had to survey. So you will see some harvests that occur in those HCAs, or that planned harvest that will occur in there. But as we transition to the new implementation plans, that's where that information and the targets would be at.
Thank you so much. Laura, over to you.
Hi, so I think Cindy, I don't know if I heard you correctly, but did you say that you can't release the newest draft of the HCP while it's under NEPA review? Did I hear that correctly?
Cindy, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, the services have asked us to retain the final draft HCP until it is released with the final EIS.
Okay, is that in the HCP handbook? Because that's not a traditional restriction when you go through this HCP process. You're the applicant, your HCP, you can release it if you want to. So just because they ask you to do it, or is it actually written down somewhere that you can't?
Well, they have asked us in good faith to not release it until it goes out with the final EIS. And we don't have anyone here from the services, but I can certainly get back to you on why their preference would be to hold that back. We certainly do not mind at all. We just want to make sure that it's final before it goes out.
Yeah, it's just not very transparent. I mean, you guys are running through slides with bullet points, but seems like it would just be easier to release the drafts as they're updated. So
thank you.
Yeah, if you can get an answer for that, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And also to follow up, I'm not sure if this was said in the presentation, but a document will go up later this week, I believe, with some of the changes to the HCP since the March 2022 draft. It'll provide a little bit more detail than you saw today. But I hear you, Laura, on the full draft. It's not that. Great. I see a hand up from Susanna, and then we might move to next steps and then take a short break and then get into kind of additional questions so that we have a time for everyone to hear the next steps as well. So Susanna, over to you.
Hi, thank you again. I don't know if you do rodenticides, baiting for mountain beaver. I know that the people that rescue the raptors, the hawks, the eagles, owls, etc., are finding that rodenticide poisons that are decoagulants are affecting all their birds that they're trying to rehabilitate that have been rescued. So I think it's really, really important to not use them on forest lands. And I personally think mountain beavers have existed millions of years before lots of other mammals as they are now, and I'm fond of them, but I'm more fond of all the raptors that are getting damaged by these decoagulant rodenticides. And I'll have some comments for later over something else, but thank you.
All right, thank you, Susanna. And I'm sorry, do we have a hand up from Cody? I think I might have missed that one. And you might be on mute. All right, Cody, we can't hear you if you are speaking, so we may try to get back to you. There we go. No, still on mute. There we go.
No, Laura answered our question. This is Brandon Wood and Cody from South Coast Lumber Company listening in on this today. And Laura answered our question, and we've been writing emails, our questions on the side too, for you guys to answer at a later point when we get ready.
Great. Thank you, Cody. Okay, well, with that, I do want to spend a couple of minutes on next steps and just kind of closing this quote unquote formal part of our meeting before we have just some time for additional questions that we didn't get to today. So next slide on our kind of next steps here. So as you heard today, one of the next steps is to release the draft forest management plan and modeled outcomes that, you know, are part of the FMP and the Habitat Conservation Plan in June of 2023. And in September, on September 6th, a Board of Forestry meeting to provide direction on the draft FMP and the HCP. So that would be a great place for folks to listen in, make comments if you'd like. And then in January 2024, we would expect a Board of Forestry decision to initiate rulemaking on the forest management plan if they decide to move in that direction. Another thing we wanted to note, and actually let's go to the next slide here. Oh, it's just thank you. Another thing that we wanted to know is that we are planning another meeting open to the public, likely this summer, to help folks better understand the modeled outcomes when they come. We don't have a date for that meeting, but just kind of keep an eye on your inboxes, and hopefully you're signed up for the HCP and FMP mailing list. If you're not, please do sign up. It's the websites are in the chat here so that you can get information, especially about a public meeting in the summer, so that you can learn more about the modeled outcomes. With that, if we can take down the slides, I'll hand it over to Mike for any kind of closing thoughts. And then we'll do a quick break before we keep going with some of the questions from today.
Yeah, and we can come back to a number of things during the question and answer period after this. But I do want to thank again everybody who came today. If you're not hanging on with us, enjoy the rest of your day. If you are hanging on with us, we'll see you in a bit. But we really do appreciate the opportunity to bring about better understanding and clarity on what we are doing with the forest management plan and the HCP going forward. So I don't know if you wanted to take a break, and then is that what you were going to do, Sylvia? Take a break.
Let's take a quick break and come back at 3:05. Do folks need a break people that are answering questions here. Come back at 3:05, and first up for questions, we have Michael Lang and Paul Earlbach, and then we'll keep going through the queue. So raise your hands if you have questions. And we'll be back at 3:05, just quick break here. Thank you.
Sylvia,
Yes.
how do I get all of the links off of the chat? Can you email them to certain people? Can you email them out so that we have them? I don't know. I'm on Zoom right now. I'm on my computer, but I don't know how to get all the links and all the information off of chat somewhere accessible for me after the meeting.
Yeah, I would concur because those links are invaluable. You did suggest doing screen captures, but then you get to try to re-enter all of them. In other Zoom sessions, I've been able to just copy what's in the chat and then paste it into a word processor, and that has worked beautifully in other situations. So I don't know what's going on here.
I don't either.
Yeah, we can follow up with a email with all of these links. I'm not sure why either. That's happened to me before too. With some chats, you can copy them and some you can't, and I honestly don't know what the difference is. We can try to troubleshoot it in these next few minutes, see if we can figure something out, but otherwise we'll send a follow-up email with all of the links. Apologies if it's not working.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Sure. All right, folks, hopefully you're able to take a quick break there. I think I see some ODF staff back on the line. And first, just to respect kind of folks that we didn't get a chance to hear from before, I wanted to open it up to first Michael Lang and to Paul Earlbach, if either of you are here.
Yeah, Paul is here.
Okay, Paul, why don't you go ahead while we wait for Michael?
No, I'm here too, but go ahead, Paul.
Oh, and just a reminder to please say your name and introduce yourself, your affiliation when you're speaking here. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. So my name is Paul Erlbach. I'm the school superintendent for the Neocani School District. And as the district superintendent, the forest management plan will directly impact funding for the Neocani School District. And then has there been consideration how the plan will negatively impact school districts that receive timber revenue? Neocani is one of the few school districts that we don't receive any basic school support from the state. So 25–30% of our funding comes from state timber.
I'll go ahead and Mike, go ahead, Mike, if you're gonna jump in.
Oh, sure. Thanks, John. Hi, Paul. Yeah, thanks for the question. And so the only analysis that we currently have of how it affects the taxing district, which, helps fund your schools, are basically in the draft EIS. And I know there is some dissatisfaction with the analyses that were done in there. It is based off of the modeling that was done for the comparative analysis in 2020, although the comparative analysis in 2020 for the board decision there really didn't go down to the taxing district level at that time. The draft EIS does and does show which are most negatively impacted. And so those results have been made available to the board as well as to us. Now that's in terms of the HCP. In terms of the FMP, I think the discussion is further on what the timber management strategies or other management strategies that the board expects to see in the areas outside of HCAs and RCAs. From the staff position, currently we are focused on those areas as our general stewardship areas that will be where the timber production really comes from. However, the board still has to give us some direction on that. And I'm not saying there's not other values in that area. I'm just saying that is the emphasis for that area at this time. That's how we're framing that up.
Thank you, Michael.
Ron, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered it. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Michael Lang, Wild Salmon Center again. So the greatest permanent value for Oregonians over time is the guiding standard for state forest land, I'm sure as everybody knows. And that doesn't guarantee a certain set level of harvest or revenue to the counties or taxing districts. Not to say that that isn't important, but it doesn't guarantee that. And your recent polling results showed that Oregonians overwhelmingly favor, as a value statement, clean water, salmon, fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, safe drinking water. All around 90% of respondents, or close to that, in the high 80s, responded that that's their top values. Timber harvest was far below that. And not to diminish the importance of that, just reciting the results from the polling that you all commissioned. So the question is, how are these values expressed by Oregonians, again, to achieve the greatest permanent value for Oregonians, influencing decisions, for example, made with the forest management plan? And that's a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. And again, I think it is primarily through the board consideration of those things. And so obviously the board has given quite a bit of attention to the Oregon Beliefs and Values Center survey that you're referring to. And we've looked at it as well. We think that we are doing a good job of providing those things. And that's all in the eye of the beholder. I'm sure different people have different opinions. And it'll be up to the board to help land in that place and, provide us the direction and the balance that they think is appropriate there. That being said, there are some things in that survey that are, it's always difficult to tease out with those sorts of things. And I think there's still a strong undercurrent in those survey results of people appreciating the industry, appreciating forest operators, and wanting to make sure that that capacity continues as well. And so there are a lot of questions to answer. Needless to say, state forest can't necessarily provide all of that. I think it's incumbent on all landowners, land managers, to really help play a part in that support. But anyway, I guess the real answer to your question is we're putting together what we think is something that is responsive to that. And I guess it'll be up to board direction to let us know what they think. Does that get at it? Okay.
Thank you. Laura, over to you, and then we'll go to Susanna. And I'll also say, if folks were putting questions in the chat that didn't get answered today, please go ahead and raise your hand to ask those again, because we're not sure if your questions were answered or if you still have those questions. So please feel free to raise your hand. Laura, over to you.
Hi again. So Mike, so you referenced to Paul's question that the DEIS had the social economic impacts for those taxing districts, but your new modeling shows that all of that analysis was wrong, because you assumed that you were going to get an average of 225 in harvest, and now it's down to 173 as an average. So those DEIS numbers don't answer Paul's question. So are you going to be updating those or having the feds update them, or how will you address that, because your modeling was wrong compared to what you've put out now?
Yes, the modeling was different compared to what we have now. And what we will be doing as part of the FMP is our own economic analysis as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. And it will be more in line with the 714 analysis that you're used to seeing, which I think will help with a lot of the issues that folks had around the economic analysis and the EIS, which is how the feds decided to do it in their document. I don't know that the volumes, we haven't looked at those by taxing district yet. And so I don't know how much they varied compared to the overall level as to what came out. There's still a lot of decisions to be made with the FMP. A number of decisions, especially those around the scale at which the planning is done and the timing of the flow of timber over the long term with the plan. So for instance, all of our IPs currently are done at a district level, which is a spatial constraint that's put on that district. And when we do it at a different level, it may look very different. It allows the model a lot more space to find its solution. And then quite frankly, there's questions for the board around flow of timber over time. For those who do not track closely on how we've done this in the past, we've typically targeted a non-declining even flow of timber. There is no rule that says that we have to do that. We could, harvest some more now and some less later. There's a variety of tools at our disposal and the board's disposal to kind of help know those impacts a little bit more discreetly.
Okay.
And manage them, quite frankly.
Yeah. I guess, what's unfortunate is that those new harvest numbers, I mean, that's kind of the new ceiling now. Maybe you squeeze out a little bit more if you switch to a departure or, change up some management inside HCAs, but you're not going to get that 250 or that 225 by changing from a departure from an even flow. So I wouldn't expect those numbers to get any better than what the DEIS said, but I guess I'll be curious to see what your all's economic analysis looks like when you release the FMP. The other question that I had, it was what Michael had just referenced a study. And I think Ron, or Mike, you referenced that it was the Oregon Value Study, but Michael, you referenced that it was what ODF commissioned. And so you guys should be clear that if it was an ODF commission poll, because that needs to go through a public process and review and all sorts of stuff, or if the board was the one who commissioned it. So that was a little concerning to hear that it was actually commissioned by the state and not by this independent organization.
Oh, thanks for calling that out. It was the board. Thanks for the clarification.
That's still a public entity though, so that's still concerning that it wasn't done in a public process.
It was not the full board.
Thanks. Do you want to clarify that a little bit more, Mike?
I believe Jim Kelly mentioned at a board meeting at which it was presented that he had requested that survey be done. I believe he did also mention that he had asked board members for any input, questions they might have. And there was some discussion around that in terms of one board. Yeah, there was some discussion about perhaps the lack of input that he had gotten from some board members in terms of questions they would like to see as part of any such survey. But it was not a board specific decision to do such a survey, I don't believe.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks, Laura, for the questions. Susanna, over to you.
Hi, over the years, I've asked ODF if they realize the added value large trees give to a finished product for plywood and clear fir and just a high value timber that has a higher selling price than the timber from smaller trees, the less quality of the timber and therefore less income from those. So when they go into the bidding process, has it ever been studied that does ODF recoup the added value that these trees give to the people that end up buying them in the mills? And I'm not sure if I'm saying this quite right, but I think people know what I'm trying to say. Because there's huge pressure from the county taxing districts that are desperate for funding since the RETA and investment, the different trust instruments of the Wall Street forestry lands that pay no taxes to counties since they implemented those tax structures and have left the counties really struggling for enough money in their budgets. And so there's huge pressure on ODF because our property taxes are not reflecting, like in Clatsop County, the 50% of our land that's owned by Wall Street timber companies. And I'm sorry, I'm a little bit rambly in my thing, but has that been studied, realizing the added value that big trees that ODF grows in their bidding process? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that in a general sense, and then if Kevin Boyd's still here, he can pile on. But essentially, what we do is we use a subscription service of which we are a member that reports back to us what basically they're paying for logs at the mill, pond values, and we factor that into our appraisals for the size and of timber that we're putting out there. So we do the cruise, we determine the types of logs that are coming off of it, we apply those values that are being seen, real market values, and then we do our appraisal and put it out there for bid. In terms of the finished product, there's a lot of nuance there, and we don't control that. Whatever a purchaser chooses to do with the product, they can do, as long as they're paying us the appropriate sawmill price that they bid on it, or pulp price or what have you. So in terms of direct marketing and trying to sell special finished products, we really don't have that kind of control or that kind of marketing, but we do certainly appraise our logs at a fair market value. And I'm gonna hand it over to Kevin so he can tell the real story.
Yeah, I would just add that we try to market our product in our notices of timber sales, and we bid to the highest bidder. And our highest product that we see is definitely for poles, and our purchasers do a good job of merchandising that out, and our bids reflect that. However, when you get to large, older timber, bigger timber, you decrease the amount of mills that are able to still manufacture that product because of how they're set up. So they're set up really to run second growth at high production. And so you decrease your bidding pool, but we do see higher value, in our pole material. And we do advertise, when we advertise in our notices, by diameter and age, so the purchaser knows what they're bidding on.
Can I comment again? That yes, they're reduced mills to handle big logs, but the big tree mill is in Klatskanai, and it's just adjacent to the major ODF timber producing counties. And then there's the Hampton Mill in Willamina that does the plywood. So the mills that really need those big trees are very close by. And, my worry is that there's not a lot of competitive bidding, but I don't know who bids, if it's just the loggers that are bidding, because there could be a variety of people. But it came up early in the meeting. I just want to make one comment about enough loggers. I have 70-year-old pole timber, close growing timber that's perfect for poles. I asked 3 different companies because it needs a high lead tower. And no, none of them have ever gotten out to look at them. One company said they have 5 towers and they only have enough people to man 2 of them. But this was like last summer, I think, maybe even the summer before, but nobody's gotten back to me breaking down my door for this really high quality, but harder to cut because of a hillside and needs a tower timber. So I don't know that it's lack of timber. I think it's more lack of workers.
Yeah.
That's my comment. Anyway, thank you.
Appreciate that. All right, see hand up from Joe, and then we can go to Barrett and Cody. So Joe, over to you.
Joe Barker. I just have an odd question. When formulating the HCP and the FMP plans, was there any consideration given to the private forest accord that was just recently passed, or will that be implemented later on?
So specifically, when we were designing these, the private forest accord was not yet in motion. And so we were out ahead of that with our HCP strategies for riparian conservation areas. It is interesting that a lot of the core concepts are kind of the same. However, one of the things in the private forest accord in the report is it is specific to private lands. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that a couple of state agencies were already moving out on HCPs for a fairly significant land base, one of them being us and the other one being DSL for the Elliott Research Forest. And so it's very, so the two are really just kind of, they weren't at the same time. PFA was behind what we were doing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Barrett, over to you. Oh. And Barrett, looks like you're on mute.
Yeah, there we go. Yep. Sure. I mean, just trying to target my question for where you are staff, in process. And there have been since March, as I understand it, conversations around trail construction. I kind of work with recreation groups of all kinds, trail recreation groups, especially in this area, motorized and mountain bike trails. And there have been discussions since March about how to get in and actually at a fairly specific level regulate the amount of trail construction per management zone, per district, per year. And so I guess my only my best lever here is just to encourage you to represent in negotiations that the best science in the world around trails just does not support either, specific lumping all trail use as trails, a backcountry motorcycle trail as compared to a close-in staging area equestrian trail or four-wheel drive trail. They could not be more different. So, I think we know that's probably not supported anywhere. If you have information on that, I'd love to hear it. Also, the question of the pacing and the quantity in a kind of numeric level over a 70-year period is very specific for an HCP that probably I'd recommend be located in the FMP, and share that the very worst conditions for trail management occur on federal lands where this type of approach is taken, where numerical numbers of mile trails are divided, kind of separated from best practices and qualitative assessments and adaptive management. So please share my thoughts. Any feedback is great, but share my thoughts as these discussions go forward.
Thank you, Barrett.
Appreciate that, Barrett. And I will take a second to respond to part of that and just say that, we're not really in, in terms of approximating the amount of something that will happen over the permit period is really a piece for the services to be able to adequately assess, their take and however they're going to do it in the biological opinions. And so I just kind of want to make sure everybody has the understanding there that it's not a matter of negotiating with the services around a limit they want to see as much as it is them needing us providing them with an estimate that they can use to write the biological opinion. But I 100% agree with you on that. I mean, different types of trails certainly have different types of effects, and really the focus of the HCP are the BMPs to help, make sure that we're the most significant issue of not delivering fine sediments to the waters of the state, of course, and really kind of anchoring into that. But I totally hear what you're saying there. Not all trails are created equal, and that's certainly the case. I think the BMPs for different types of trails over time will just kind of reflect those differences.
Thanks, Mike. Cody, over to you.
So my question is, we're sitting down here in Southwest Oregon. Good stewardships of the land, South Coast Lumber is. We're really looking, we understand what's going on with everything, but we're trying, really hard on our part to figure out what we can do stewardship wise and being good foresters and doing the best job we can to make, with the private accord stuff coming up and stuff like that, and how it got overlaid on the state ground. What are we looking for on South Coast property to see where we're going to be at? Because if I've talked to stewardship foresters down here, they have no idea. We've talked to everybody around to try to get an overlay of what we're going to lose or how we're going to manage different. It changes our whole management philosophy across the board. And I'm just seeing if Michael has anybody has any input, if an overlay comes out or anything like that, to be able to see where the new rules are going to take place and how it's going to go, just like the state had to do with their ground. We're just trying to kind of follow in the suit and do the same thing like that to see where we're at.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so, kind of a couple of different things there. And, I mean, one on the private forest accord, I'm not the expert on that, the Forest Resources Division, and would have a better answer. I do know, however, that they are working on analytical products now that will, be out there, that folks will be able to see how those strategies lay out on their own ownerships and understand the ramifications of those, in terms of like actually having to, the new FPA rules specifically. And that's kind of as much as I know about that. Speaking from the standpoint of the lands that we manage down in that neck of the woods, which aren't many anymore since we do not manage the Elliott anymore, but we do have a few thousand acres of Board of Forestry lands down there. And that's a really good example of where this HCP is, quite frankly, really necessary, given the T&E constraints that we have down there. So we have looked at those impacts down there, and we do know that we will be able to harvest, more than we can now under our current take avoidance strategies, for sure. And so I don't know if that really kind of answered your question very well, but I have to kind of punt a little bit on the PFA stuff.
I appreciate that.
Thanks, Cody. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. The climate change and carbon plan purpose and vision would be to establish Oregon as a leader in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and establish that Oregon's Board of Forestry and the department are national leaders in climate smart and socially equitable forest policies, etc. So my question is, how is this being incorporated into the development of the forest management plan? And particularly, does the department have a baseline for sequestration and carbon storage? And have goals been established that would carry out the purpose and vision of the climate change and carbon plan to establish Oregon as a national leader? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that softball, Michael. So yeah, we do not have, from the state forest perspective, we don't really have something that we would consider a baseline from which we would, draw that, other than past management and our experience over the last 20 years, 20 plus years of managing under the original and then revised FMP. And I think that probably gives us a good place to know where the board members are starting. But having never had a performance measure for carbon before, specifically for carbon storage in that sense, we were a little bit of a loss. And so I think that really needs to be determined. From the standpoint of resiliency and forest health, I think, well, first of all, I'd say that we're already doing a lot of things that do contribute to that. We have done, over the course of the last 2 decades, a heck of a lot of thinning. Thinning is a very general prescription. A lot of partial cut prescriptions that are really looking at promoting habitat, promoting diversity, and so forth, which certainly helps make stands more resilient. And we saw that even in the Labor Day fires and some of our older stands that we had made into habitat. They burned, don't get me wrong, but they didn't necessarily burn as severely as some other stand ties. So he's had some pretty good success with that. Turns out fuels management and habitat benefits can almost be had at the same time sometimes. But anyway, so from the resiliency and adaptive piece, I think there's just more work to be done. Part of it is adaptive management and research, and we are, participating in assisted migration research. We have some plots on our land. I'm not sure how much Tyson would probably know there. And, just staying active in that community to try and better understand what we can do to make our forests more resilient. Because we know we're going to have more fires. We know we're going to have drought stress and increasing temperatures and so on. And so how do we deal with that from the young stand management on up to mature stand management?
If I could just add to that, we originally in the FMP, like our first list of draft goals and strategies included sort of a standalone climate goal with associated strategies. And in looking at that and hearing feedback from the public, and then also looking at the climate change and carbon plan, that the agency has produced. We decided to pull that out and then elevate climate change to one of the major themes of the plan, so that not every, but goals and strategies are viewing them, are placed within the context of climate change, promoting resilient forests, and the recommendations of the climate change plan for state forests specifically. So we just sort of tried to make sure the whole plan aligns with that other plan as well.
All right, thanks, Michael, for the question. Mike, Nick, appreciate that. Let's head over to Jen and then to Trygve.
Sorry, my dogs are barking. Okay, so I asked it before, but it wasn't really answered. What is the overall vision from ODF? Maybe even, I know you won't speak on behalf of the board, but for ODF, what is your overall vision of state forests? We have the Elliott that's under a huge HCP. We've got lots of other HCPs. We've got the Western HCP barreling down at us. We got the FMP that shuts down more timberland. We have the private forest accord that impacts over 10 million acres of private forest land. What is the overarching vision for Oregon's forests from ODF?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jen. And it's a tough question. It's a complicated question. And, the vision really from the standpoint of the agency is to have a healthy and productive forest that really provides us with the ability to provide all those three different outcomes from GPV. Given the fact that the board's going to tell us within the context of any specific forest management plan where we should be landing, what that balance is. And so that's kind of the difference, I think, between what we do and what they do, is we need to bring them something that's not limited too far in one direction or the other, that provides those options that they are able to work from. And so we think we have, at this point, we are bringing them something that, provides a place where they can, a jumping off point for them that provides the social, environmental, and economic potential that they're looking for. And I will say the key difference with the HCP is the other piece that's not really spoken to directly in GPV, but in terms of business certainty, that is really the focus of the HCP in the future, is to, and why we have 17 covered species, some of which are not listed yet, is because we see those listings at some point on the horizon, and being able to already have the plan in place to be able to manage for those. And so there's that little bit of a twist with the HCP.
So a couple of those species might not need to be listed anymore, right? So is the forest management plan, will it change if species get delisted? Will the HCP change if the species get delisted? Is that the main objective of these things?
So, yeah, I mean, ideally, the focus of the Federal Endangered Species Act overall, right, is to actually get species off the list. Now, it's not incumbent upon an HCP applicant to bear the burden of recovery all by themselves or anything like that, but sure. If a species if we actually have a point where a species either goes extinct or is recovered, we do have the ability to amend the HCP and remove that species. It would be during that amendment process that you would determine, okay, how does that change the conservation actions? And so the adding and removing a species, extinction or delisting, whichever, is it's an adaptive management question, but it's an adaptive management question in terms of if you want to amend the plan, not in terms of adaptive management within that current plan. So a little bit of a nuance there, but yes, there are mechanisms for that.
Okay, my last question is, the harvest levels are going to impact counties. It's going to impact industry. It's going to impact actual real people that go out there and do these jobs. And I know you know many of them. Is there a way, or could there be a way for them to be able to access the numbers easily so that they know how badly they're going to be impacted by all of these HCPs and FMPs and the PFAs and is there ODF is helping implement the PFA. So you guys do know those numbers. You have those numbers accessible to you. Can they be accessible to us? Can they be accessible to us for the HCPs? Somewhere easily, the industry can get in there. A logging company can get in there. A mill can get in there and see how much they're going to be hurt so that they can figure out if the juice is still worth the squeeze to stay in business.
Certainly, we will bring that forward in a digestible format, specifically for state forests. Our outcomes are a little different than what they will produce for the private forest accord or anything that goes through an FPA scenario, just because that's sort of a how shall I describe it? It's a little bit more just a cookie cutter thing and an assumption on acres out of production, whereas we have the more nuanced modeling results. But yes, I will keep track of that question and bring it up with Josh Bernard and ask what sort of time, what their timelines are for bringing that forward and having a total impact, I guess, brought forward. There was a presentation to the board recently by, you probably caught that, Forest to Market and then the Beck Group. And they provided some very high level numbers on their estimates of what that decrease would be. So there's also presentations like that, although granted, those were very high levels and obviously don't account for the final FMP modeling that we'll be doing.
So the counties know what they're going to be missing out on. The counties are already, coming up against, with the HCP, I'm specifically thinking Coos, Tillamook, and Clatsop counties. They're extremely concerned with the HCP. And they have numbers, preliminary numbers of what they need to shut down, what services they're not going to be able to do anymore and all that kind of stuff. That's what I'm kind of looking for industry is also.
Okay.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Mike. Trigby, over to you.
Thank you. The thing I'm concerned about, particularly right now, is, well, there is the very laudable goal of healthy, productive forests. We have out there very clearly within our current concerns, the IPCC modeling for climate change. And I'm hearing that with all your modeling, you do not presently fully incorporate the impacts of climate change on your decision process for managing the forests. And, even that recent heat dome that we had here in the Northwest had really major impacts on many tree species. And we can reasonably anticipate more significant heat domes of that type. So I don't really understand in terms of climate smart planning and goals, why there isn't more explicit incorporation of climate modeling into your modeling. You've got an extensive model and the Forest Service does have a climate simulator that could influence your planning. Why is that not being done?
So there's work to do there, and I'll let somebody else talk about moving forward. But looking back to the analyses we brought forward for the HCP, we made a decision pretty early in the modeling effort actually in advance of modeling, I think during the business case, which wasn't modeled, not to try to model stochastic events, but meaning chaos, of which climate change is one, but the issue is there are many others. So economic cycles, changes in Oregonians' values, wind events, etc. And so it was like, do we go and model one, which then biases the whole thing towards that single stochastic event or dynamic, or do we go the full Monty? And we decided to do neither.
Well, thank you for that. It's, I mean, clearly, one of my concerns is the protection of the older tree resource that is especially effective at carbon sequestration. That is something your decision-making process can appropriately incorporate into your planning, and namely to let those, 70 to 90-year-old trees grow for additional years and take advantage of that high level of carbon sequestration they're capable of. And so especially in terms of, climate smart forestry and being a leader in terms of climate smart forestry, there is very clear science on the high value older forests and older trees in being really fundamentally important for mitigating the climate change we're presently experiencing. So I would deeply like to hear a little more emphasis on that kind of thinking, which is, I guess, mostly opinion, but I think there is considerable solid science documenting what I'm speaking of.
Yeah, Trygve, thanks for that. And I just wanted to add, a little bit to Nick's comments, and also just make sure that, you don't have the impression that we aren't concerned about that or aren't, trying to factor that into our work. There's a lot of work that we are doing that incorporates, climate into our forest management plan. The specifics around not using it in that model is something that, appreciate the feedback on. But I just want to make sure that you don't walk away from here with the impression that we're just ignoring, what is in our climate and carbon, carbon climate change plan framework that we have as an agency, or the work that is being done, in our adaptive management planning framework and performance measure, as well as, the context of the forest management plan as well. And we're doing a lot of work with cooperatives. We stay connected to a variety of cooperatives. So, and as well as even, what you'd mentioned about older tree preservation, the HCP is a fundamental conservation strategy within those HCAs, has roughly 43% of the forest that's going to be just growing. They're not counting the riparian conservation areas. So that's a huge commitment towards a strategy, aligned with what you're sharing. Just want to provide that, our comment back.
Well, thank you, Ron, for that clarity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Trygve. All right, I still see a few more hands up. So Barrett, back over to you and then to Jen.
Thanks, Sylvia, and applaud the whole team for having these check-ins and pretty extended time for discussion. I hope it's been valuable to you guys, and I think it surely has been for attendees like me. I wonder if I'm the only one who's missed short answer, if you've captured volume coming out of HCAs, for example, where you're managing for habitat over time, or if you don't try to capture that volume in the popular volume metric forecasts. So just the perception that the perceptions around this volume, does that number include the volume coming out of the these non management zones.
Yeah, I'll start, and if others want to, jump in. So thanks for the question, Barrett. And if you're referring to the modeling that was done for which, like the implementation modeling we just did for our revised IPs, are you referring to that, or are you referring to other modeling for the DEIS, et cetera? Just curious.
Forward looking, yes, not just for the.
Yeah. So we're working on improving that. So the current modeling we did just for our revised implementation plans, that's a goal-driven model, and the model, didn't exercise all the opportunity that is allowed in policy, once that policy becomes adopted. And that's why we have a range within our revised implementation plans that are currently out for public comment that provides some of that planning Colleen mentioned about taking a look at things that we could do within those that are aligned with the conservation actions, in the HCP. Some of the activities that, are within the policy space to do are not simple to drive a model to optimize all the acres in a set period of time for. So it doesn't, capture all of those currently. And we are allowing some space, in real human planning to go in and take advantage of some of those opportunities, while also looking at how to possibly improve driving the model for our future work.
I would just, one concept on the street is that there won't be management to keep up with the volume growth in these habitat areas. And of course, there's going to have to be quite a bit of management to achieve some of these goals, especially, you've got to engineer disturbance in some of these zones. You also have huge hardwood dominated stands that are unproductive, but they're in HCAs. So there's going to be volume and management there. And I think it'd be a misperception to think that was going to be left to grow in an unmanaged way. So therefore, it's also going to be delivering volume maybe folks hadn't considered. So thanks.
Thank you for that, Barrett. Jen, over to you, and then we have Chuck with his hand up. So Jen, over to you.
All right, I've got a comment, then I have a question. One of the participants was talking about the IPCC. The IPCC actually says it isn't enough to plant more trees. We need to harvest more trees and use those trees sustainably. Lumber is the only renewable and sustainable building product on Earth. We have a housing shortage. We need to build with wood that locks up carbon. Cement industry contributes 8% of the world's emissions. The steel, iron ore industry contributes 5% of the world's emissions, whereas Oregon contributes 0.14% of the world's emissions. So we are already green. Second of all, I have a question from somebody that can't get through. What data proves that the current plan is failing, which has triggered a new plan?
Yeah, a couple things there, then Mike or someone can weigh in. So, the board directed us to pursue a habitat conservation plan several years ago. And in so doing, for all of Western Oregon, the conservation strategies that are being developed within that habitat conservation plan aren't completely aligned with the goals and strategies of the older plan. So we need to make a plan that's complementary, to that, and updates considerations that the board has in their own, balancing of GPV as well. So there were a variety of factors that occurred over the last 13 years since the 2010 revision to the forest management plan was done. A variety of economic concerns, throughout the 2010s post-Great Recession, strong interest in increasing conservation from state forest, increasing durability was a huge driver in that as well. The current plan is a one-size-fits-all approach of structure-based management that attains some relative percentages and maintains those over time. But given that those plans are applied to a very broad area, all the stands aren't necessarily suitable for attaining those stand structure types. So there's a variety of things that pointed to the need for a revision, to the plan. It's not just a single point of failure, for instance. And happy to hear Jeff comment.
It would be a fair assessment that the vision for Oregon's state forests is conservation?
No, I wouldn't say, well, I'd say stewardship of the forests. Nick presented our management approach that considers the forest ecosystem and, interfacing and managing the forest in a way that keeps those natural systems functioning over time. So that conservation value is eminent, and plays out through the management approach and the forest management plan. However, in the balance of outcomes that the board wants us to get from these forests, there's certainly an economic factor to that. It's a mandate that we have as part of our structure, and governance to manage these lands. It's to produce a sustainable and predictable flow of timber. It isn't defined at a level, but it isn't the overarching singular approach is conservation, equating conservation to not management.
So you have an obligation to harvest, but in the last 40 years, we have seen a reduction in timber harvest. So I could argue that it's conservation over social and economic.
I would say that's inaccurate for state forests. The harvest has increased demonstrably from the initiation of this plan in 2001 to today. Harvest has only gone up through that time and hasn't gone down. So I'm not sure that's right. And at the same time, we reduced the 2001 plan called for 40 to 60% of the landscape in complex, desired future condition complex, meaning old forest or layered. We reduced that to 30 to 50, and then we reduced many districts' targets towards the lower end. So arguably, you could argue the opposite. We've seen a reduction in conservation over the last 20 years.
I wonder why the counties are screaming so loud. The county commissioners, the trust lands are screaming so loud then because they feel that their revenue source is being dried up more and more and more and more and more.
You'd have to ask them.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, everyone. Chuck, over to you, and we just have a few minutes left here. And I think you're on mute.
I have a quick comment on the HCP and its origin. Under John Kitzhaber in the 1990s, there was a movement to have a Western Oregon HCP and an HCP that would apply to state lands. Concurrent with that was the non-listing, the voluntary non-listing by NIMS in the state of the coastal coho, the only one salmonid stock, salmon stock out of like 23. It was illegal. It got overturned in court. The timber industry had a hissy fit and said, because there would be a listing of the coastal coho, there'd be no HCPs done in Western Oregon. So, whereas Washington and California worked towards HCPs for state lands and other lands, we lagged behind, and now we're trying to catch up and introduce proper planning with some certainty for the future. So that's just my comment here about people that are upset about we're having an HCP. This is ridiculous.
Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate the comment. Let's just make sure to stay respectful of everyone who's in the room today, but appreciate the sentiment there. I know we are really running out of time here. I want to respect time, so I think we'll probably go ahead and close the meeting here, looking at ODF. I heard so much interest today in really wanting to make sure that the needs of timber companies, jobs, counties, recreation, making sure we're protecting the climate, making sure we're thinking of species, natural environment. So many needs and interests are here in this room today. And I think this conversation and these questions really highlight the challenges of building a plan that meets all of these needs. So really appreciate the hard questions and the comments today. I think, Mike, anything else you want to say kind of before we close out?
No, not really, other than thank you again, everyone. Appreciate everybody's thoughtful questions and comments today. And the fact that it took us this entire time really shows your interest in what we're doing here, and we just really appreciate it. Look forward to future engagement in the future.
Yeah, and to follow up, we will send a follow-up email with the links and information from today's meeting. Apologies if the chat is not copyable. We're not really sure why. So look for that follow-up email as well. And with the recording and everything, all the information will be available soon. I think meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ODF staff.
you.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.